All right, morning show with Anthony here on 92.9 and 96.9 EHM. Happy to have one of my favorite authors of all time and a good pal of the show, David Browne, is joining us. David, good morning. How are you, my friend?
Pretty good, Anthony. How are you?
Doing great. I have right here, you can hear it, a copy of the new book.
I hear that tapping sound. Yeah.
By the way, isn't it just, there's something, I'm all for Kindles and technology. I'm all for carrying 700 books with you down to the beach in Mexico and taking a vacation. I'm all for that. But there's nothing like just the feel of a good hardcover book, the smell of it. There's nothing beats that.
I agree. I'm not going to argue with that. I like that feel myself. I'm old school. I even think things like covers and pictures look better in print than they do on ebooks.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. And this one looks beautiful, by the way. So the book is Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young: The Wild Definitive Saga of Rock's Greatest Supergroup. I love the title. I love the subtitle. I love the photo that you chose. Is there any significance to that photo?
Well, it's from the Fillmore East in 1970, which was significant in that it was their last. It was the tour they did right after they put out Deja Vu in 1970. So it was the big moment for them in the culture. Neil Young had just written Ohio, because Kent State had just happened. They were performing that song during the shows, and it was really the moment when they were just so plugged in to not just the group itself, but the zeitgeist. I mean, Deja Vu was a massive record. Ohio tapped into and was, really articulated what their generation was feeling that had just happened, and they recorded it quickly, put it out as a single right after Deja Vu came out. They were playing big halls. It all fell apart for the first of many times right after that, but that moment really kind of crystallized, and they were working on all cylinders. They were just cranking out all these new songs. They were playing new songs live on stage that hadn't even been on record yet, like Neil was doing Don't Let It Bring You Down, and Stills was doing Love the One You're With, and these songs weren't even released yet. They were just like, hey, I wrote a new song, let's play it on stage. So it was quite a moment for them.
It's unbelievable. We talk about prolific times. I was just talking about Bruce Springsteen the other day. He's got the new album coming out, and he just said, oh, I wrote a whole E Street Band album too, because it just kind of came to me. And we were talking about how artists, that just kind of happens, that even though even the great songwriters are even like, I don't even know where this came from sometimes, so when those prolific moments hit, it's something that you got to take advantage of. And it was kind of crazy that was all happening at the same time for these four gentlemen.
And it's still happening now. I mean, Neil Young just announced recently he's just cut a new album with Crazy Horse, which he hasn't done in 7-8 years at this point. With Nils Lofgren now in the band, and they banged out like a dozen or so songs in no time. And
it was like 2 weeks or something crazy like that. Yeah, like 2 weeks.
Yeah, and that's a whole discussion here. But I mean, it is a fascinating new era. To see that generation of rockers still writing new songs as they're approaching 80. Some of these folks, they're in their 70s, pushing 80, and the previous generation, the Chuck Berrys and Jerry Lee Lewises, some of whom are still with us, like Jerry Lee. They basically, just began recycling the old songs 100% of the time, in their 30s. It's like, we really didn't hear. Chuck Berry released a new record right before, or came out after he died. But I mean, that was his first record in like 30 years. So I mean, to hear this older generation of classic rockers actually writing new songs in their older voices is all new terrain. So it's really going to be interesting to hear. Yeah.
All right. So David Browne is with us here. The book is Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young: The Wild Definitive Saga of Rock's Greatest Supergroup. Get more info on David Browne at david-brown with an E.com. That's david-brown.com. My sister stole the Grateful Dead book that you wrote. And my father he came to visit a week or so ago. He was already eyeing up this thing. So I don't know how long I'm going to have this for.
I think you better glue it to the coffee table or something.
Yeah, seriously. I got to hide it. My family members keep stealing your books. But we all love your stuff. But can I give you one criticism?
All right.
Okay.
Go for it.
If I was writing this book, I would have wrote, your ending was meh. I would have wrote a different ending. I would have ended the book with them reuniting at Woodstock 50. But that's just me, David. That's just how I feel.
That would have been great, but Woodstock 50 itself looks iffy right now, and so far only Crosby has been signed up to do it, and it would have been nice too. It would have been nice if they all got together and did a 50th anniversary, final tour, as a lot of these folks are doing right now, these farewell tours. And when I started writing this book and working on it, which was 3 years ago, I thought, maybe if it comes out in 2019, there'll be a little who knows? Maybe they'll get together for that such tour. But yeah, it doesn't look that way. There's still not. I think there's still a lot of lingering animosity in that group, and Neil is moving on as he always does, and so it was a good idea. I wish I had that ending too, Anthony. Other than they're all in their separate corners again.
Yeah, I know. It's and when and Woodstock 50 is where it is, but even when the rumors of that started coming together, the first thing I thought of was like, oh my God, a CSNY. Like, if I felt like if there was anything that could get this band back together, it was Woodstock 50. But even that doesn't seem like it's possible.
And Michael Lang, who's the guy behind Woodstock, the original one, and he's working on a new one. I interviewed him for this book about 3 years ago, a little over 2.5 years ago, about their role in the original festival. He also booked them CSN for Woodstock 94. And so during the interview, I said, so, you're going to do a Woodstock 50th? And he was, at that point, he was like, yeah, we're thinking about it. I want to do it. And even he said, I'd love to get these guys back together. And he had already, at that point, 2.5 years ago, put out feelers. And even then, he said to me, like, I don't know if this is possible. He said, there's a lot going on now. It doesn't look good, So there was even a sense back then that he definitely wanted to do it, no question. But it may have been too broken at this point.
Yeah. I want to talk about the group itself, but I want to talk a little bit about the book too, because, you mentioned 2.5 years ago that you were working on this. I looked at the source notes, and I don't know if I've ever seen this before, but you have over 25 pages of source material on that. I mean, this must have been a massive undertaking for you.
It was. I try to do similar things with all my books, but I think in this case, I did a lot of my own first-hand interviews. I was able to get David Crosby and Graham Nash, and then, probably about 100 or so of their associates, from people like Judy Collins and Roger McGuinn and Mickey Hart of the Grateful Dead, who spent a lot of time with them hanging out, to former band members and managers and girlfriends, things like that. But I also spent a lot of time, as I always do, but in this case particularly, going back and reading old interviews with them, going back to the 60s, old newspapers, forgotten old newspapers and things. And, I felt like I wanted to include some of that material, some of the things they said in the moment, because they really, there's so many fascinating things about them, but I think in a way they pioneered social media. They were like basically dissing each other publicly, before there was a Twitter. They would just do it in interviews, and they would just say things, out front, how they felt about one another at particular times. And I just hadn't seen much of that. We're used to feuds in rock history, but I mean, this one, it was pretty open right from the start. And so I wanted to include a lot of that material and credit it to the original, newspaper reporters and stuff back in the day. So that kind of expanded it. And the other way that, of course, they also pioneered social media in a way was, of course, that they wrote songs about each other, sometimes explicitly and sometimes not. And that was another way that they kind of communicated with each other, not directly, shall we say.
Right.
It almost reminds me, I hate to bring up this analogy, but the way people who work for the Trump administration will sometimes go on TV and say stuff so as a way to communicate with him, because they know he's watching. And so like with CSNY, they would sometimes write songs about, instead of saying directly, here's how I feel, let's write a song about this is what's bugging me about you.
Right.
Just put it on a record.
They pioneered the diss track or the shade throwing on social media. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So they really, one of many ways they pioneered things. They kind of broke ground in rock, as well as just their singing and songwriting and just approach to being a group, which was unconventional from the start.
You touched on CSNY in Fire and Rain, which was the first book that I came across of yours, and we always seem to kind of reference back to it, but that was more about them sort of falling apart. Was that the opening seeds of like, I want to expand on this more? Did you feel like there was more to be done about CSNY after you wrote about them in Fire and Rain?
I mean, I felt that way before I even wrote Fire and Rain, because I've been sort of tracking them since I was like a teenager, way back when. I don't know if I want to say when that was, but I discovered their music when I was 13 through one of my older sisters, and immediately was drawn into that world and on their group records, and they were already making solo records and duo records, and it was this whole complicated musical family tree that I hadn't quite, seen anything like. And of course, the one thing you realize right away too, for those of us who've been following them for a long time, is things were never quite stable. So, I saw them for the first time as a trio, Crosby, Stills, and Nash in Madison Square Garden in the late 70s. And I was like, wow, they're back together. They have a new album. Great. And then 6 months later, you read in Rolling Stone or one of the magazines, they're broken up again. Wait, what? And so, I've been tracking this since then, and this whole saga has kind of been in my head, and all this music they've made, and so I think, when I finished Fire and Rain, which was, of course, just about 1970, I thought that was so much fun to kind of write about them in that period. It would be nice to write about what happened before, and of course everything that happened afterwards. And there hadn't been too many books on them before, so I thought, it felt like a good time to do that and to sort of tell this story that had been sort of knocking around in my head for decades at this point, and just to kind of be able to tell it was kind of exciting.
Yeah, and what's cool is it's a story that continues to evolve, because it's not a story about a 70s group, their story has ever evolved even up until a few years ago, It
is, and I think it's one of the things that's interesting, and maybe people forget, is that people do peg them as a 60s group or maybe a 70s group, but they have sort of tapped into different things at the time, whether it was Neil going techno in the 80s or discovering country music around that time, or even when they did the last CSNY reunion tour, which was 2006, and Neil had written all those songs about the Iraq War and George W. Bush, and he got them all together again to do a tour playing those songs, and again, they tapped into something, but I think a lot of their fans agreed with them, but there was a certain amount who didn't. And so, when they would play those songs like Let's Impeach the President down at certain shows in the South, the audiences were not as responsive and made themselves known and would boo and walk out. And so that to me was also really interesting to write about, as much as the early days, because here they were older, they'd been through the wars themselves, they were back to writing political songs about current events, and not everyone was in tune with them. A certain percentage of their generation was had gotten a little more conservative, and that was I think that was a shock to them, and it was really fascinating to write about that as well. And they tried to remain relevant and saw the changes around them.
Yeah, it's funny too, because it's one of the criticisms that I see from people on Woodstock, which is almost unfair to take internet criticism as anything these days, because all there is criticism on the internet.
Do people do that on the internet? I'm not aware of that.
A smidge from here and there. Yeah, but a lot of people are saying you can't replicate Woodstock. It is what it is. You can't recreate that. But I'm kind of like, but can't you remember it fondly? Can't you have can't you continue that torch a little bit? Seems like we're really distancing ourselves from being able to just do whatever, and kind of trying to keep everybody in this little box all the time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, why not try to? I mean, I think to celebrate Woodstock at 50 sounds like a fine idea. If you blend, the lineup is interesting. They have a lot of, assuming it happens, they have enough of the surviving acts and a bunch of the new acts. I think what's the problem is that everybody thinks back to Woodstock '99 and some other attempts that were almost disastrous, and it's almost too bad that some of those previous ones happened. If it was just that sort of poisoned the well a little bit,
Right.
Woodstock '99 with rioting and burning stuff and throwing, it was kind of messy. So I think some of those memories are lingering in people's minds, like, oh God, they tried this already twice. And you had people throwing mud at Green Day in '94, and so I think people's memories of the original one have been tainted a bit as a result of what's come after.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but though I'm trying to think back to '94. I don't know if I remember hearing all that. Oh, you can't do Woodstock again in '94. Like I feel like that kind of went off without any issues, or I shouldn't say without any blowback in the beginning.
There weren't. I mean, they it was a little messy at times, and there was some rain, and I think there were some issues here and there, but nothing as bad as everyone predicted. And I think the blowback was that in '94 they had like corporate sponsors, they had expensive bottled water.
Right.
You had to buy, the ticket prices were higher. So there was some of that they got the blowback for. But looking back at that festival. It was actually pretty impressive, I mean, you had people like Green Day and sort of Sheryl Crow and a bunch of acts like really kind of breaking out in a way, and I mean you had Nine Inch Nails and Dylan, and it was funny in my book I wrote about CSN being part of that, and they unfortunately I don't know who made this decision, I couldn't quite figure that out, but yeah, they were slotted in between the Rollins Band and Nine Inch Nails. I mean, it's hard to imagine a worse slot
Right.
for a group like that. I guess they were trying to vary the pace, a little bit, but I mean, as David Crosby told me, he said it was just like animals. He's looking out on stage, and people are trying to mosh to like their songs, which are not mosh pit friendly kind of songs, and he just,
That's very funny.
One of their road crew told me he had an idea for that, was that he wanted them to play off the fact that they were the quote unquote old men of the festival. He suggested that they be rolled out on stage in wheelchairs by nurses, women dressed as nurses, and then of course they'd stand up and start playing, and it didn't go over well with the group, so they did not do that.
Oh, but that would have been good though. It
would have been funny.
When they popped out of the chairs, the people would have went crazy for them. That's hilarious. That's really good. I think Kurt Cobain did that, didn't he? Didn't he get wheeled out in a chair once?
That does sound familiar.
Right?
Yes.
I know he played a whole show in a hospital gown. I think he was wheeled out in a chair though for that show.
I do. I think you're right about that. I'm sort of picturing that image in my head, but when that was, I don't remember.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. All right, I want to ask you I always love asking you this because it's my favorite question for you, what you learned during writing this book. But I'm going to tell you what I learned first.
Okay.
What I found to be pretty fascinating. I mean, and there's great facts, there's great stories. Like the one good thing I could absolutely say 100%, you paint wonderful pictures, of scenes, and you put us in places when things are happening, which I really, really love. But the one thing that I guess I never really thought of was something that you point out early on in the book. And that was that all of these guys, while they were trying to figure out what this was going to be, all had these like big insecurities about them. And that it was some of those insecurities that helped feed their need to find one another, and that maybe, ultimately led to some of their undoings. But it's funny because like you always elevate rock stars, but I never really thought that they could be insecure people. But when you point it out in the book and you see some of that early forming together, I think it was at the Whiskey A Go-Go, It's like that was to me like the refreshing thing of like, oh yeah, they're normal people too. They were coming from bands that were, breaking up, or, who knew if they were still together or not. So there was like a lot of that insecurity that maybe even drove the start of this group, because when you look at them now, it's like, that's the supergroup, right? That's the first one. That's the greatest one. But it's kind of crazy to think of like these just little insecure people that were like looking for, that sort of, backup from their peers.
Yeah, and that's something I learned myself as I researched it. Because you think they were all coming from different groups, and Stills was in the Buffalo Springfield, and Crosby was in the Byrds, and Nash was in the Hollies. And you think, well, they were all successful to varying degrees and had their followings. And yet, there was a certain, Jerry Maguire, you complete me kind of aspect to the group coming together that became more in focus as I talked to them and got more of a sense of their situations at the time. And, I think Graham Nash always kind of felt kind of uncool as a kid growing up north of London, and he wasn't in hip London. He was in this little town, part of Manchester, and, he just, kind of wanted to, and he was in the Hollies, who were a great pop band, but weren't considered hip and cool and cutting edge as much as they tried. And I think, he looked at, when he meets Crosby, it's like, David Crosby in 1966, 67 was the epitome of rock cool. He's the guy with the best weed, and he had the cool look about him with the mustache and the capes and all this. And that really clicked with Nash in a way of like, oh, this is my entree into kind of feeling hip, feeling cool, and same with the other guys, and Stills being a little insecure about his own singing and guitar playing, which sounds ridiculous, but wanting having someone like a Crosby who could be a real cheerleader type, egging him on and telling him he was great, and Crosby, wanting to, more of a brotherhood situation for himself and feeling insecure about that. These were just young guys trying to figure out what to do next. Someone asked me, well, what brought them together? And, unemployment is part of that answer too. Crosby had just been booted out of the Byrds, and he was feeling like unwanted, and Springfield had broken up, and the Hollies were still together, but Nash wasn't happy with them, and they were all looking for, well, what do we do now? And it's just this, this confluence of people in a period that just no one could have predicted, but it's just the way these things come together.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, but it's like, it's something that you don't think of, but it, even in daily life, like even if, you're not getting along with coworkers, or, your family members are being mean, a lot of the times that's driven by insecurity, and it's kind of crazy to think that it was even evident in a super group like this. Like you said, the voices, the singing, the songwriting, how could these people be insecure? But they really, really were, especially at the beginning.
Right. And a lot of artists are.
Yeah.
And in all fields, God, stand-up comics, Jesus, I think maybe we don't always think of musicians that way, because they just seem like, so you see them on stage, they seem so confident, so in touch with themselves in some ways, but these were just kind of, these were just young guys trying to figure out how to make a living, how to make their way in the world. And, you got to remember back then, no one knew if rock had a future. It's hilarious to see interviews that say, there's a famous interview with Mick Jagger in the mid-'60s where he's asked, well, what do you see as your future? And he's like, well, I'll do this for a couple of years, but it's probably not a career. I don't know, figure out, what happens next. No one thought you could have a long-lasting career as a pop star.
Yeah,
because it hadn't really happened yet.
Yeah, it goes.
And so there was a little bit of that probably driving them, like, what is my future?
Right, got to score it now while I can, kind of a thing. But yeah, it goes back to what you said about, the early musicians and just playing their hits. And once you hit 30, like, that's it. Chuck Berry and all those guys. It's true. Right. Nobody thought we'd still be, the idea that if CSNY got together tomorrow and announced a tour, it would probably sell out in seconds was probably foreign to them 50 years ago.
Right.
All right. This has been fun talking with you, David. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, the wild, definitive saga of rock's greatest supergroup. Was there anything, there's so much great stuff in there, the Bruce Springsteen softball thing, and there's a lot of fun stuff in there. But was there anything else? You said you learned some stuff. Did you? I don't want to give away too much of the book because I want people to get it, but what was the other thing that you kind of learned while going through this little journey with the guys?
I think I learned a little more about how Neil came to join the group. And, we see Neil Young now as this icon who's certainly done very well on his own, doesn't really need any group, even though he kind of jumps around different combinations. But, we forget, and I forget, that, in 1969, he was a struggling solo act, and by the time the first CSN record came out, which was 50 years ago this month, that record did really well. But by that point, he put out 2 albums after the Springfield that were not commercial successes. We all think of Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere and those songs, Cinnamon Girl and Down by the River. These are classic Neil Young songs. But we forget, and I sort of forgot, that record peaked at like number 125 on the Billboard charts, and so when this idea was floated of him joining them by the head of the record company, it benefited all of them. CSN needed another musician to back them on stage, to boost their sound, but he needed the exposure. It really benefited him a lot. I think as the years have gone on, we all think, well, they're all waiting around for him to give the go-ahead to a reunion, which is totally true. But back then, he really needed them. And they needed him, and that kind of set the template, and it worked. After he joined that group, albums like Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere were suddenly hits. They had the second wind, and he was suddenly part of a supergroup, which he wasn't before. So that was really interesting to me to kind of just wade through all those stories and facts and try to piece together that timeline of when this all happened and how that union benefited everybody in different ways, including Neil.
Yeah, it's funny. I never thought about that because it's true what you say. So much time goes by where he's kind of in that power position. You forget that's right. Like you said, that's how it kind of started, though. Yeah,
and and even like before they settled on Neil, They were very confident. CSN were very confident in themselves from the start, and they needed somebody else to play guitar or keyboards on stage, and they were even asking people like Steve Winwood, And I said, I think it was during one of my interviews with Graham Nash, I said, "You asked Steve Winwood to join the group as your backup musician?" And he's like, "He was just Steve Winwood back then. He wasn't like some superstar. Traffic had broken up." He was looking for work, and you forget, these were just young guys looking for gigs,
Yeah.
Dallas Taylor, who's the drummer who has since passed away, but I was able to interview him a few years ago. He remembers he and Stills going to London and making that offer to George Harrison.
Wow.
In the studio. They ran into George Harrison in the studio. They're like, "Hey, you want to join our band?" Because the Beatles were falling apart too. And so, of course, George didn't really go for that, but but again, it was just these were young guys looking for what's next. What do I do? What kind of work do I get? And groups are falling apart left and right, and they were they weren't icons.
Right. Well, I don't know if it's just because we're so used to saying CSNY, but I don't know if CSNH would have actually worked all that well. It doesn't sound
it's interesting, to envision that, how any of those combinations could have sounded.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe Neil was the right way to go.
Yeah, probably, right. You and you got to speak to Peggy for this book before she passed?
I did get to speak to Peggy Young before she passed. Very, very sad that she passed away earlier this year. And yes, we spoke about, her first memories of meeting the other guys and being part of that tour in 2006. Actually, that was really interesting when people were, not happy with those Bush songs, and there were bomb-sniffing dogs backstage, and she remembered some of that stuff. And so, yeah, she brought some really interesting perspective, and even seeing Donald Trump backstage and Neil Young shows, which she's witnessed. We forget Donald Trump was a big Neil Young fan.
Yeah.
They had a falling out a number of years ago, and especially once Trump started using "Rockin' in the Free World" at his rallies, and Neil was not happy about that. But there was this period when Trump was really into Neil, and he would, in fact, in that 2006 tour that I mentioned, I saw that show here in New York at the theater at the Garden. It's called now. It always changes names, but
right.
And right there in the front rows were sitting right near each other were Salman Rushdie, Patti Smith, and Donald Trump. One of the strangest combinations of celebrities at a show I think I've ever seen.
That's what CSNY does. They bring it all together.
They do. It's quite the rainbow coalition of music fans there.
Absolutely. All right, 50th anniversary of CSNY. So this is a great way to celebrate. If you have a Crosby, Stills, Nash Young fan in your life, this is an absolute perfect gift. David's a phenomenal writer, like I said, a fan of all of his books. David-Browne.com. Browne is spelled with an E, david-browne.com, and you can get it at Amazon and wherever else books are available. What else are you working on, David, so we know what to look out for in the future?
Well, have another book coming out in the fall, Anthony. It's funny you asked.
Wow. Look at you making the rest of us look bad. Jesus.
I know. This is more of an editing job, I have to admit. But my very first book back 18 years ago was called Dream Brother. It was a dual biography of the late Jeff Buckley and his father, Tim Buckley. And coming this fall, I've worked with his mother, who runs his estate, Jeff's estate, to do a collection of his journals and writings that he left behind, and as well as various memorabilia, contracts, and paperwork that were left behind. And we've put that all together into a sort of telling the kind of the story of his life, arranged it all chronologically, and these pretty beautiful, I think, reproductions of his journals. He had very lovely handwriting, so it's all very legible. So that's coming out in October.
Wow! And are you actually going to include some photos of the pages in the book? Yep. I love that. Similar
to, say, the Kurt Cobain Journals book, if people know that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we've actually just reproduced the actual pages. And it's called Jeff Buckley, His Own Voice, and it will be out in October.
Oh, I love that. There was something, who was it? It was Jeff Buckley's tour manager or somebody just wrote a book about him, and it was not well received by the family, from what I understand.
It came out about, one of his former managers wrote a memoir, came out about a year ago or so. I don't think those two camps see eye to eye on a lot. I don't think the family issued any kind of public statement about it, but I've only kind of skimmed it myself, so I can't even comment. But I was in the middle of my own books. I was writing 2 books at the same time. I didn't have time to read that many other books, although I should catch up with that at some point soon.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you made some time for us this morning, David. I really, really appreciate you coming
Always happy to support EHM, one of my favorite stations, keeping the free-form, progressive thing alive, which is so important in this culture.
Absolutely, my friend. Absolutely. This was a pleasure as always. I think we're good. Anything else that we got to cover?
Let me come back in the summer and do some playlist stuff of my own. So
please do.
I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, let me know when you're here, and we'll set you up and we'll get you in here.
Sounds good, man.
All right, man.
Thanks, Anthony.
Take care.